guys, this week we're talking about designing the thinking classroom. This is where we're all headed. Welcome. We are going to explore what does it take, especially now, to build a thinking classroom. And thinking about this is not just another leadership strategy or just another one-off initiative. It is about changing the culture of learning principles. So many times when we go in the classroom, it becomes places where students kind of learn how to be complacent and comply instead of a thinking classroom, right? Our goal today is to really dive in to see how we can intentionally design the classroom every day, right? Be meaningful, exude wonder, question, analyze, explain, make meaning every single day. So think of yourself not simply as an instructional leader, but as an architect, right? And so thinking about, we don't just build buildings, we design environments that truly shape behavior, and that's what we're starting to do with learning. So we think about the compliance, like that trap of that compliance. When students walk into the room, the first day immediately we start kind of learning what success looks like. And traditionally we spend our first days reviewing rules, procedures, expectations, and truly classroom management. Not just saying that should be done, but if that's all students experience, the hidden message becomes school's about rules, following directions, and compliance, right? But imagine on day one, students are already solving meaningful problems, collaborating. They're already sharing ideas and experiencing that productive struggle based on what they're going to experience for the entire year, right? And so that culture begins immediately. Students begin believing and understanding, I come back to think. Right? Culture isn't something we kind of just talk about. It's just something we have to allow our students to experience. So then we have our traditional versus our true thinking classroom. I think this comparison really captures the shift of the point I'm trying to make. Traditional classrooms often reward completion, but our thinking classroom reward understanding of the concepts. Our traditional, often, rescue our students from struggle, but our thinking classrooms truly understand what struggle is, where the learning happens. And I want you to also notice that the teacher's role changes as well. So instead of being the person kind of with all the knowledge, all the answer, the teachers become the actual designer of student experiences that help students discover these answers themselves, right? And so which classroom produces independent thinkers after students leave? So that moves me into the culture of thinking. Culture isn't just one strategy. It's built from hundreds of tiny little decisions that teachers make every single day, from how we spend our time, the different language that we use in the classroom, right? How we change and arrange our furniture, the questions we ask, are we putting it into our curriculum, the expectations that we communicate from our students, the routines that we continuously reinforce. Every one of these encourages thinking, or sometimes it could discourage it. But the great news is every teacher already can influence these forces already. So the question is, what are we doing, and is it intentional? Now, this is really called understanding the map, right? Our true understanding is much bigger than kind of recall and remembering information, right? Students move through these multiple stages. Of course, they're observing to kind of see, then they're starting to ask questions, right? A little bit of the inquiry learning. Then they kind of gather the evidence. Then they're making connections, right? And then they're considering alternative viewpoints, right? Now they're explaining their reasoning, as well as revising their thinking. Just true, real understanding is active. And so students don't arrive by understanding by kind of listening longer. They arrive by kind of the longer thinking process. So now we're at the day one activation flow chart. Make sure you take a picture of this because this is key. So this kind of slide gives us kind of a blueprint for the first day of school. I want you to notice something interesting. The academic work starts immediately. Students aren't waiting 3 weeks before they engage in rigorous thinking. We welcome students. Of course, we're building their safety. And then we co-create these experiences. We're normalizing struggle. Then immediately we engage them in meaningful work. Right? So when students struggle and when they see just enough information to make sense of it, they become aware and they start to experience what psychologists call productive disequilibrium, that moment that becomes increasingly memorable in their lives. So now we're talking about what is the language of the thinker, right? Sometimes the biggest instructional shift isn't changing our lessons, it's changing our language. So instead of saying, yeah, I like your answer, try saying, I noticed. Instead of asking, who knows the answer, we ask, what do we think? And instead of providing the answers, we ask, what truly makes you say that? These subtle shifts move ownership of learning from the teacher back to the students, right? And so these questions and our questions that we ask in our classroom help shape the culture of our classroom. So now let's talk about the productive struggle curve, because I know you want to hear this, right? This might be one of the most important visuals today, right? So learning happens in the middle. We know if tasks are too easy, students tend to disengage. If tasks are too hard, students kind of become frustrated. So our goal is to find that sweet spot where students are challenged, but also supported. This means scaffolding without kind of rescuing our students, right? So providing hints instead of the answers, questions instead of explanation. Our job is to manage that productive struggle and just not eliminate it. So this is our thinking toolbox. So if we want students to think consistently, we need consistent thinking routines. These routines constantly reduce cognitive load because students already know how to participate and engage. So notice these three categories on the board. First, routines that activate curiosity. Second, routines that consistently encourage collaboration. And third, these routines that develop the metacognition, right? Thinking about our thinking. These routines must become habits, and eventually students will begin thinking this way naturally. So here is the metacognition, right? This may be the most powerful routine in this part, right? So I used to think, now I think, my thinking has changed because, right? And so this forces students to reflect on their own learning journey instead of just getting the answer right away. They examine how their thinking has evolved over time, and that reflection builds that intellectual humility. So students begin realizing that changing your mind isn't a weakness, it's the evidence of ongoing learning. So now we're talking about the environment, right? So let's pretend that we walked into your classroom after school, right? Without truly hearing you teach, right? What would we learn about your classroom? What we see? Will we see student thinking on the walls, or only the polished final product? Would desks encourage conversation, or the only teacher-directed instruction? Would that physical environment consistently communicate our expectations? Even though you may not think, our classroom is speaking even when it's silent in the room. So now looking at students is kind of the last, right? The last protocol. Instructional coaches, PLC teams often spend a lot of time kind of discussing teaching, right? And this protocol shift in the conversation just toward learning, instead of asking, did students finish? We constantly ask, what evidence do we see that students were actually thinking? We kind of notice the cycle, collect evidence work, bring our teachers together, study the thinking by our students. We raise questions. We refine our instruction that we're doing in the classroom. We have never kind of evaluated teachers, but we're not even thinking in that kind of term or lens, right? We're studying student thinking. And that's our goal. I encourage you to build a culture of thinking. The most important kind of takeaway is culture doesn't change overnight, and this takes a lot of work. It changes intentionally. And so it starts with like a few quick wins, changing our language, introducing one thinking routine, maybe greeting students intentionally. Then we expand, try to audit our environment. We study student thinking collaboratively as a group, and eventually these small little actions create lasting cultural shifts. So the goal kind of isn't to implement every strategy tomorrow. I encourage you not to do that, right? The goal is to consistently create classrooms where students believe I am here and I am expected to think in this classroom. All right, make sure you look at the citations, but I want to leave you with this kind of one quick reflection. Every classroom has a culture. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is, what kind of thinkers are you producing? Because students rarely rise to the expectation when we announce it. They rise with expectations when we consistently design the environment for their learning experience. I hope these tips help. Talk to you later. Let me know if you need anything. DM me for more. Bye!